Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
My mother leaned in before the rehearsal dinner like a manager leaning over a player before the last inning, not asking but instructing in that careful tone she uses when she wants to sound loving while drawing a line with a marker that stains, telling me there would be no surprises tonight and that my brother needed to shine without any shadows or commentary from me. And I said sure because disagreeing in that moment would only feed the story she repeats about me, the one where I supposedly make things about myself when the truth is I learned a long time ago that in our family silence is the currency that buys peace for everyone else, and if you run out of it you end up paying with your reputation instead. I am not going to pretend I did not feel that familiar pinch of being managed, because I felt it the way you feel an old injury when a storm is coming. And I told myself I could do one evening of smiling and nodding and letting the spotlight sit exactly where everyone decided it should sit, because it is not my wedding and it is not my stage and I am not the person anyone came to hear. Yet that agreement pulled in all the little years behind it, the years of school concerts where my mother asked me to clap a little softer when I was recognized because my brother might feel overshadowed, the years of family updates where my wins were reframed as cute distractions while his were billed as the headline. And I realize this makes me sound bitter, but I am just telling you the bone truth, which is that you can love your family and still know exactly the script they keep handing you. So I walked in with my quiet face on and the promise anchored to my tongue, and I hugged him and told him I was happy for him, and he looked genuinely relieved, which almost made me laugh because relieved from what exactly? From me breathing too loudly. From me accidentally existing, and I thought about the checks I had written behind the scenes to cover a vendor when their card bounced last month. The way my mother had asked me to keep it quiet because it would only embarrass him and his fiancé, so I did what I always do. I caught the falling plate and set it down without a sound while other people took the credit for not dropping it in the first place. I wish I could tell you the room felt warm and welcoming and that I relaxed, but what I felt was a timer running inside me, not a plan, just time counting down until people started giving little speeches. Because that is where these nights always tip in one direction or the other, and I sat at the end of our table with my water and reminded myself not to take the bait if anyone made one of those jokes that seem harmless and land like a slap. And I even rehearsed the lines I would use if the maid of honor drifted into the territory I thought she might, lines that were firm without being explosive, just enough to stop a story without starting a fight, which is a tightrope I have learned to walk without a net. The maid of honor, whose name is Harper and who smiles like she learned it at a seminar, was moving around with her phone in her hand and a face that said she had something special planned, and when her eyes slid over me there was this small pause that felt like a measurement. Like she was deciding where to place a dart on a board, and I caught that look and tucked it away because I have been a woman in rooms long enough to recognize when someone is rehearsing a version of you that you have not approved, and I decided that if she stepped on my neck, even politely, I would not be swallowing it tonight, warning or not. Meanwhile, my mother did her quiet rounds, patting shoulders, thanking people for coming, and every time she passed me she squeezed my hand like a reminder, like I was a switch she needed to keep in the off position. And I kept thinking about how many times I have been told to be gracious, which, in our family, is just code for be silent while we edit your role, and, because I am not made of stone, I felt that old combination of anger and shame. Anger at being boxed and shame for caring about being boxed, and I sat there with both of those feelings like a person keeping two large dogs from running in different directions. Before the toast started, I slipped out to the front desk and asked the manager to switch the order of service so the first round of plates would land earlier than planned, which is not a crime and not a scene. Just a quiet nudge of the night in a direction that served one purpose, which was giving me a lever if I needed one, a lever that said we have to move on, we have food on the way. And if I sound strategic, that is because I have learned that when a person tells you to keep your mouth shut, it is wise to make sure you still control the hinges on the door. Back at the table, I checked the group text thread the bridal party had been using, and I saw a new pin note with a schedule that gave Harper the first toast, and I realized the schedule we all agreed to had been switched without a vote, which told me two things at once. That my mother knew and that my brother did not, and I felt everything inside me settle, not hot, just steady, because I do not mind a fair fight, but I have no patience for sneaky edits dressed up as tradition, and I promised myself I would not explode. I would only interrupt if a line was crossed, and if I interrupted, I would do it so cleanly that anyone watching would understand why without needing a lawyer. The first clinks of glasses started, and I could see Harper standing with that smile again, and I reached for my glass slowly, and here is the part that will probably make some people nod and some people roll their eyes. Because at that exact second the manager caught my eye and I gave the smallest wave, and the servers began moving toward the tables with those trays, which meant we were now technically in service and not in speeches, which meant I had a legitimate reason to stand and thank everyone for being there and to ask for patience while the first plates landed, and I did exactly that, not a power play, just a graceful interruption that moved the room forward and gave me a tiny bit of control back. I sat down while the servers started placing plates, and I thought that little adjustment had bought me a few minutes to breathe, maybe even the rest of the night if the timing worked in my favor, but Harper did not pause. She stepped closer to the microphone with the kind of determination people reserve for a performance they have practiced in front of a mirror, and she lifted her glass and spoke over the movement like a person who has decided the rules do not apply to her. And before anyone could redirect or pretend not to hear, she said, very clearly, that before we begin there is a truth that needs to come out. Harper did not clear her throat or ask for permission or even pretend she was stepping into a normal toast. She rolled straight into a message she had been itching to deliver, saying in that careful, fake-caring tone that she knew tonight was about love and celebration, but that before we raised our glasses, we all deserved a little honesty. And then she said that the venue had almost canceled on them this week because someone had called pretending to speak for the couple, asking to push the date, to adjust balances, to renegotiate details that were already set, and she said the part that made the room tilt, that the person was me, that she had confirmed it through the coordinator, that it had created chaos for everyone, and that she was only bringing it up to clear the air so the bride would not carry that weight into her wedding day, which, if you have ever watched a person choose the messiest possible way to look noble, felt exactly like that. I could feel the air turn tight around the tables as a couple of people did that performative head tilt people do when they want you to see them being shocked, and before anyone could ask questions, she added one more layer, saying she had a recording that proved what she meant, and she played part of a voicemail on her phone into the mic, a clipped, choppy piece where my voice could be heard asking the venue if there was flexibility on the payment timing and whether we could push the date if the balance could not be met, no context, no mention of the things that made the call necessary, and even though I knew exactly why I made that call and who asked me to make it and what I did afterward, there is something about hearing your voice turned into a headline that makes you want to leave your own body for a second. My mother's face did not move, which is how I know she was involved, because when she is surprised she performs surprise, but when she is protecting a plan she goes still in a way that reads to everyone else as composed. And I sat there thinking about the day last month when she called me with a very specific request to help because the card they were using for the final deposit had bounced and the coordinator was threatening to release the date. And how I had told her I could float it for a few days if I knew the money would come back, and how she said it would, and how I had made the call to the venue like a grown adult handling a bill, respectful and measured and clear that I was being asked to help, except none of that was in the snippet Harper played. Because snippets are useful when you want a villain without any boring context. My brother kept his eyes on the linen, which told me he knew enough to be embarrassed and not enough to be brave, and the bride stood there holding her glass in that rigid way that says I am hoping this is a misunderstanding, but also I am furious. And I loved her enough to understand why she was furious, because in her position I would want the person who fixed a problem to fix it quietly, not watch the fix get turned into the problem itself, and I took stock of the room and of my own heartbeat. And I did the thing my mother demanded even though she did not earn it. I stayed quiet, because blowing up in that moment would give Harper exactly the scene she rehearsed. The one where she paints herself as the protector of the bride and me as the disaster that had to be contained. Harper kept going because of course she did, saying the rehearsal dinner was not the place for drama and that we should all move forward together, and the way she said together made me want to laugh, because I know a forced unity speech when I hear one. And I waited for her to wrap it so the servers could do their work and so I could do mine, not by screaming or turning the room into a courtroom, but by using the exact tool she used against me, which was documentation, except I do not doctor it. I share it whole. I excused myself to the hallway like I needed air and opened the email thread with the venue coordinator, the one where my mother specifically asked me to step in. The one where the coordinator replied with relief and copied the bride to say the deposit was secure and the date was safe. The one where my mother thanked me and told me to keep it discreet because my brother was stressed enough. The one that had the payment confirmation receipt with my name on it and the voided warning the venue had issued when the original balance failed, and I took 3 clean screenshots that showed the request, my reply, the confirmation, and my mother's appreciation. And I downloaded the original voicemail in full from my phone's call app with the timestamp and the entire conversation tied to the back and forth emails, because if we are going to do truth, then we are going to do all of it. Back at the table, I opened the bridal party thread that someone had taken the liberty of pinning earlier when they slid Harper into the first slot, and I typed a single line. Not a lecture and not a threat and not even a complaint. Just a clear sentence that said I am attaching the full version of the call and the email chain that explains why it happened. And then I attached the audio file and the screenshots and hit send, and for good measure, because I am done protecting people who use my silence as a cover, I forwarded the exact same package to the bride directly with a second line that said I followed your mom's request to keep this quiet, but since it has already been brought into the open, you deserve the whole thing. Phones buzzed around the room like trapped bees, and I did not have to narrate anything or look around for approval because the evidence did it for me, and within seconds the coordinator, who was still on the email chain, replied all with an automatic acknowledgement, and then a second note that said thank you again for resolving the deposit issue last month, which meant anyone scanning could now see the words deposit issue and last month next to my name and next to my mother's name. And the need to perform innocence evaporated because the facts were now standing without makeup. I did not raise my glass or make a counter toast or ask to speak at the mic. I just let the thread and the replies and the silence do the work, and if you are wondering whether that counts as revenge, I would argue it counts as the exact kind I prefer. The kind that cleans the window instead of smashing it, the kind that moves the spotlight without setting the building on fire, the kind that makes a liar stand next to her own words and pretend they are not hers, and as that little wave of buzzing settled into that deeper quiet that follows a collective read, I looked at my mother, and then at Harper, and then at my brother, and I stayed seated, and I stayed calm, and I said nothing. Because the best part of telling the truth well is that it does not need a narrator, and while everyone recalculated what they thought they knew, I realized I had only just started. When the thread went quiet and the servers pretended not to hear the kind of silence that settles after a fire is contained, but not fully out, my mother touched my elbow with that practiced pressure that means we are going to step aside and you are going to be reasonable, and she led me to a corner where the flowers could have been cardboard for all I cared and said, in that clipped way she uses when she thinks a lecture is love, that while my documentation was technically accurate it had still been inappropriate to share it with everyone, and that if I respected the couple I would apologize to Harper and to the bride and keep the rest of my evidence to myself so the night could remain about celebration. And I listened to the whole thing without interrupting because I wanted to hear the part that mattered, the part where she slipped and showed her alignment. And she delivered it exactly as expected when she said Harper was only trying to protect my brother from last-minute embarrassment, and that I made her look small by responding publicly, which is when I understood that the humiliation she felt was not about lies or truth but about control, and I also understood that whatever Harper had planned was not finished. Because people who want to look noble in a room do not stop after one performance, they plan sequels. I told my mother a single sentence, that I had no interest in embarrassing anyone and that I would not be apologizing for telling the truth, and she did the thing she always does when I do not fold. She turned her face into a mask of disappointment and said I was making this about me, which almost made me laugh, because if protecting a bride from a stage story is making something about me, then I will accept the title and wear it like a name tag. And I walked away before I said something I would not regret but would be asked to regret anyway, and I told my brother I was leaving early so he could go home with a clear head, and he nodded without really looking at me. And the part of me that still wants to rescue him from his own passivity felt that old ache, but the rest of me knew it was time to act like a grown woman who refuses to be the family trash can with a lid on. At home, I did not pour a drink or pace or call a friend to rehash things I already knew. I opened my laptop and started sorting the timeline the way I do at work when a project goes sideways because someone decided the rules were for other people. And I pulled up the coordinator's contract and found the clause that banned third-party promotions without the couple's written consent. And then I opened Harper's social accounts because she broadcasts like a lighthouse when she wants attention. And there it was in plain view, a stack of saved stories with vendor tags lined up like a party they wanted to be invited to, and a caption that said something bland about partnerships and a wedding series dropping after the big day. And I knew she was trading on the event because she had already been emailing vendors on the couple's behalf to secure upgrades, which I suspected but now needed to prove. So I wrote a polite note to the coordinator asking for clarification around any requests made by the maid of honor regarding timing, toasts, vendor credits, and program edits, and I hit send without saying more, because there are moments when a direct question is the sharpest tool you can use. The coordinator called me back instead of writing, which told me she had been waiting for someone to ask, and she spoke carefully in that way professionals do when they know they are walking on a wire. And she said she had indeed received multiple requests from Harper over the past 2 weeks, including a request to move the order of toasts so Harper could speak first and a separate request to add a line in the printed program for a special thank you section naming a handful of vendors with handles and contact details. And when I asked whether the couple had signed off on those changes, she admitted they had not, that she had only received approval from the mother of the groom for the toast switch and nothing official for the program additions. And then, after a small pause that carried a lot of weight, she said there had also been a meeting where Harper suggested that any microphone time at the reception should include a nod to the vendors who had been generous with their packages. And I did not need a translator to hear what that meant. I asked the coordinator to forward any emails or texts that showed those requests along with the contract clause I had found, and she said she would send a summary and copies as long as I kept her out of any public drama because she had a business to run. And I told her I am not in the business of burning down honest people, I am only in the business of removing hands from levers they did not earn, and within minutes my inbox filled with a tidy set of receipts, including a message from Harper's personal account to the videographer asking for raw footage for her content series, a note to the florist about a content collaboration with phrasing that made my skin crawl, and a draft program file attached to an email to the coordinator where the maid of honor had slipped in a special gratitude block with clickable elements that would land readers on brand pages. And now I had more than a feeling, I had the spine of a plan. Before I touched the bride with any of this, I needed to decide what outcome I wanted, because with family you can confuse vengeance with justice and then wonder why the victory feels like ash, and what I wanted was not to blow up a wedding. What I wanted was to stop a hijacking and restore the night to the two people it actually belonged to, which meant I needed to block the speech switch, shut down any program changes, and lock the microphone so no one could turn the reception into a sponsored segment, and I could do all of that without a single shout if I put the right people in the right positions. I called the DJ, who I know because I hired him for a charity event years back, and I asked a professional question, whether he intended to follow the written timeline signed by the couple or the version someone else was sending around informally. And when he said he was confused because he had received 2 different orders, I felt that steady anger settle in again, and I told him to check the original contract on file and to ignore any edits that were not countersigned by the couple themselves. And he thanked me in the tone of a person who has been trying to do the right thing while being fed noise. And I followed that call with a quick one to the venue manager to confirm that microphone access would be at the DJ's discretion and that unauthorized toasts could be cut politely by rolling music and keeping the program moving. And when she agreed that this is standard practice, I asked her to put that in a short note for the record, and she did, which meant I now had a clean way to disarm Harper at the reception without looking like I had ambushed her, because I had not. I had simply restored the rules she tried to erase. Only after those locks were in place did I text the bride, not with a wall of evidence or a demand that she pick a side, but with a human message that said I needed 5 minutes with her and only her before hair and makeup the next morning. Not to ruin her morning, but to protect it, and she replied with a simple yes and a follow-up that said she appreciated how I handled the venue story earlier, which was the first moment that night I felt something like oxygen return. And I promised myself I would keep her informed without putting her in a position to manage anyone's feelings on her own wedding day. As for Harper, I sent her one line and one attachment. The line was not dramatic and the attachment was not a threat. It was the contract clause about third-party promotions with the coordinator CC'd for context. And the line read that any vendor shoutouts or collaborations needed the couple's written consent and that the ceremony and reception would follow the original countersign program. And I ended it with a sincere note that said the best gift we could give the bride was a day free from surprises, echoing the words my mother had tried to use as a leash and turning them into a boundary. And I put my phone face down and let the clock run, because there is a point in every conflict where you stop pushing and wait to see who blinks first. I was almost ready to sleep when my inbox pinged with something I did not ask for but could not ignore, a forwarded thread from the coordinator that included a single screenshot captured during a meeting the previous week where Harper, in a moment of sloppy confidence, had logged into the shared planning account and sent the videographer a message using the bride's name to request those raw files for her content series, which meant impersonation was now part of the story, and I stared at that little rectangle of proof and knew I was holding a fuse that, if lit, would change not only the speeches and the program, but the way everyone understood the faces at the front of the aisle, and I closed the laptop without sending it anywhere, because the choice of when and how to use it would decide whether I was there to punish or to protect, and I wanted to be very sure that when I moved next, it would be the last time I had to. The next morning, I woke up earlier than I needed to, not because I was excited for a wedding that promised a clean slate, but because my head was replaying the voices from the rehearsal dinner like a looped tape that would not stop unless I forced it to. And instead of wasting time arguing with myself about what I should or should not have done, I sat at the kitchen counter with coffee that tasted bitter and started mapping out how the day would look if I allowed Harper to move unchecked versus how it could look if I stepped in before she turned someone else's vows into her personal broadcast. It was not rage that pushed me forward. It was that steady, practical kind of anger that comes when you realize the lies will not slow down on their own, and when I thought about my mother asking me to apologize, I knew in my bones that any apology now would be filed away not as peace, but as proof that I could be bent again whenever it was convenient. At 9, just as I promised, I walked into the suite where the bride was getting her hair pinned back, and I asked for those 5 minutes I had requested the night before. And she nodded because her eyes said she already knew something was off, and she would rather face it with me privately than have it explode later with an audience. I laid it out without dressing it in dramatic language, telling her about the program edits Harper had pushed through without consent, about the vendor mentions that would have turned her ceremony into a free commercial, about the email impersonation where her name had been used to ask for files she had never agreed to release, and I watched her shoulders stiffen not because she doubted me, but because she knew immediately the kind of storm that would have hit if I had stayed quiet. And when I showed her the coordinator's documentation, she closed her eyes for a long second, then opened them and said one sentence that gave me the permission I needed. "Whatever you think is necessary to stop it, do it." Those words were not vindictive. They were tired, the kind of tired you only hear from a bride who wants one day in her life where she is not managing other people's schemes. And I promised her I would not derail the celebration, but I would lock it back into her hands, and she squeezed my hand with a kind of gratitude I had not expected after the mess of the night before, and she said she trusted me, which meant I now carried a weight I could not afford to drop. From there, the rest of the morning was logistics, and I handled them the way I handle projects at work when someone tries to rewrite a contract midstream. I called the DJ to confirm again that no one would touch the microphone without the bride or groom's explicit request. I spoke with the coordinator to double-check the printed programs and made sure the special gratitude block had been removed. I asked the venue manager to have her staff run the timeline as it was originally written, and then, because I know Harper's type, I created a folder with every piece of documentation, the emails, the screenshots, the program drafts, the impersonation message, and I printed a hard copy with timestamps. Not to hand out like flyers, but to have ready if she decided to escalate and paint me as the meddler again. By the time the ceremony started, I had calmed myself into a kind of rigid stillness, because my role was not to shine and not to sabotage. My role was to make sure the bride and groom stood at the center without a shadow creeping in, and I stayed quiet through the vows. Through the exchange of rings, through the applause, reminding myself that the fight was not about the marriage. It was about who believed they had the right to frame the story of it, and when the recessional music rolled and people shifted toward the reception, I knew the next few hours would decide whether Harper succeeded in turning her curated drama into a permanent part of their wedding memories. At the reception, when people began eating and waiting for the toasts, I saw Harper shifting in her seat with the impatience of someone who has rehearsed her performance more than once, and when she finally rose with that same practiced smile, the DJ glanced at me first, which told me he had been waiting for the signal, and instead of handing her the microphone, he leaned forward and said into it that our next words would come directly from the best man as outlined in the original program, and then he handed the mic not to Harper, but to my brother's college friend who was already standing, and the look on Harper's face in that moment told me she was realizing her plan had been sealed off before it could even start. The best man's speech was light and sincere and full of harmless jokes that made the bride laugh instead of clench her jaw, and when it ended, the DJ rolled the music exactly as we had discussed, leaving no space for an interruption. And as people clapped and reached for their glasses, Harper tried to rise again, but the manager stepped smoothly into the gap and announced that dinner would be served, and the servers appeared like clockwork, which meant she would have to fight the entire system if she wanted to claw her way to the microphone, and she sat back down with a thin smile that looked like broken glass. I did not gloat, because gloating would have ruined the clean lines I had drawn, but I kept my eyes steady on her long enough that she knew I had been the one to lock the doors she tried to sneak through, and she reached for her phone like it was a weapon, probably thinking she could still make her move online, but I already had the coordinator, the manager, and the DJ copied into an email chain that made her attempts obvious, and if she tried to twist the story now, she would be exposing the receipts I held in my folder, which meant she could sulk, but she could not spin. My mother caught my eye from across the table and gave me a look that mixed warning and disbelief, and I understood immediately that she had not expected me to win. She had expected me to flare up and then be dismissed as the family problem again. And now that I had cut off Harper without a scene, she had no script to fall back on, which is why she turned away without saying a word, because sometimes silence is the only tool left when control slips. As the evening went on and the dance floor opened and the bride finally looked like she could breathe, I sat with the knowledge that I had not blown up the wedding, but had quietly stitched it back together before anyone else could rip it apart. And while Harper sulked and my mother simmered, the people who actually mattered danced and laughed without knowing just how close they had come to spending their wedding dinner listening to a sales pitch wrapped in fake sincerity, and that knowledge steadied me, but it also sharpened something else, because I still held the evidence of impersonation in my bag, and deciding whether to use it or not was the question that would follow me through the night, a fuse waiting for the exact right spark. After dinner, when the noise had softened into that easy hum people mistake for peace because they cannot hear the small calculations being done at the edges of the room, I stood next to the bar long enough to watch Harper pace with that tight smile she uses when she is pretending she did not lose something. And I could feel the tug to let it go because the bride was laughing again and my brother finally looked like a man on his own day instead of a kid being shepherded through a pageant. But the folder in my bag felt heavier than the clutch holding it, and I knew that if I left the last thread untied, the first thing that would happen after the cake was cut would be a new story online with my sister-in-law's name stamped across it without her consent. So I decided that if I was going to finish this, I would finish it without flames and without spectacle, just firm hands on the right levers until the machine stopped lurching and started working the way it was supposed to. I found the videographer near his gear and asked him a practical question about deliverables and rights that he answered like a professional who has had to explain the same thing too many times. And then I showed him the screenshot with the message sent under the bride's name, not shoving it in his face and not turning it into a scene, just letting him see the timestamp and the language and the account name and the draft request for raw files. And he frowned in that way people do when they realize someone has tried to skip steps, and he said he had not sent anything because he was still waiting for the couple's signed release. And I thanked him for that small act of integrity and asked him to hold the line until he had direct confirmation from the bride herself, and he agreed so easily it almost calmed me. The coordinator met me halfway across the room like she knew I would be there, and I kept it simple with her too, because simple travels without friction, and I asked her to make a single, quiet adjustment that would protect everyone without creating a show, which was to pull the DJ and the venue manager into a three-way minute where we would agree on a policy already written into the contract, but now put on paper for tonight. One sentence that said no guest, attendant, or extended party member could address the room without the bride or groom's explicit handoff, and no vendor could receive media or file requests without a signature from at least one of them, and when she nodded I handed her a printed copy of the clause with the relevant lines highlighted. And she slipped it into her folio like I had just returned a borrowed pen. Only after those locks clicked shut did I go to the bride, and I did not lay the folder in her lap or push her toward any choice. I just told her the small truth that there had been attempts to use her day as a platform and that those attempts were now blocked. And I asked whether she wanted any public correction or whether she preferred a clean, quiet finish that left her night intact, and she took my hand and said she wanted a clean finish, and that was the whole instruction, and it was more than enough. Harper made her move exactly when I expected, which is something you learn after years of being told to clap softly for other people, because the people who need the clap do not stop until they hear it. And as the music dropped after the first round of toasts, she rose with the certainty of someone who believes persistence is the same thing as permission, and before she could take 2 steps, the DJ, who had been waiting for this exact moment, leaned into the microphone with a professional ease that made it sound like part of the show and announced the cake cutting by name, and the room turned as one because sugar beats speeches every day of the week, and in that pivot I watched the venue manager approach Harper with a neutral face and a folded paper, which I recognized because I had printed it. They spoke quietly enough that you had to look to see it, and of course I looked, and I saw the paper open and a finger placed on a line, and I saw Harper's mouth flatten in the way people's mouths flatten when they reach for outrage and only grab air. And then I watched the coordinator join them with the calm of a person who does this for a living, and I will not pretend my heart did not speed up because there was a chance this would turn messy, but it did not, because the manager did not scold and the coordinator did not accuse. They simply asked a clear question about an impersonation request for raw media and whether she would like to withdraw any outstanding communications sent in the bride's name, and Harper, who lives for rooms, understood in a flash that the room would not be hers again tonight, and she said something clipped that looked like denial but sounded like retreat, and she went back to her seat with her phone face down like it had burned her. My mother started toward me with the kind of expression she usually saves for a parent-teacher conference, which made me brace for the same old script. But before she reached me, the bride took the microphone from the DJ and did something I did not ask for and did not expect, which was to thank the coordinator and the venue and the vendors in the most general, unsponsored, unscripted way, and then, looking directly at me but speaking to everyone, she said that families are complicated and that sometimes the real gift is the person who cleans up messes without asking for applause, and she moved on before the words could morph into a debate, and I felt the room land on a new setting without needing to build a new story around it. That could have been enough, and maybe on another day it would have been, but the last move I had saved was not a speech or a scene. It was an email drafted on my phone while people danced to a song that will be old in a year and perfect tonight. And in that email, I placed the screenshot of the impersonation, the contract clause about third-party communications, and a short, clear line addressed to the vendors and the coordinator that said all future requests must come from the couple, and that any previous requests from the maid of honor were withdrawn and void, and I CC'd my mother because I was done being the only person who knew where the bodies were buried, and I hit send while lifting my face toward the song like I was just another guest. Because I was. Harper lasted another half-hour at her table before deciding she needed a bathroom that somehow led to an exit, and my mother did reach me then, and she started with the line she always starts with, that I had made things about myself. And I did not raise my voice or list my receipts or tell her all the times I have been the quiet fix. I just told her I would not be her alibi anymore, and that if she wanted a daughter who clapped on cue, she needed to hire one, because the woman standing in front of her was done paying for peace with her own reputation, and she stared at me like she was looking at someone who had grown two heads, and then she turned away because there is nothing to say when the old tools stop working. When the lights came up and the last song faded into those fuzzy goodbyes that mean the night is over whether you are ready or not, my brother hugged me with a grip that felt like relief and apology braided together. And he did not use the word sorry because men raised like we were do not know how to aim it, but he said thank you 3 times in a row, and that counted more than a speech I will never get. And the bride pressed an envelope into my palm and whispered that the deposit would be returned when they settled their accounts, and I told her to keep it and to buy herself a day where no one needs anything from her, and she laughed in that exhausted way that means the laughter is real. I walked to my car with the folder still in my bag even though I did not need it anymore, and I thought about my mother's warning from the night before, that there should be no surprises, and that my brother needed to shine. And I realized she had been right, but not in the way she meant, because there were no surprises tonight. Not after I locked every door that should have been locked from the start, and my brother did shine. Not because I dimmed myself or because Harper handed him a spotlight, but because the person who was supposed to be the problem became the firewall and then vanished back into the crowd, which is not glamorous and not dramatic and, if I am honest, feels better than both, and if anyone wants to know whether I went too far, they can stand in the quiet of that room at the end of the night and ask themselves whether the right people got to own their own story, because that is the only measure I am using from now on, and by that measure I won, and I am finally fine with the fact that winning looks like walking away without asking permission.